at some point in the future. And there we go. All right, back to my screen. All right, so this presentation it's a bit of a shorter version of one that I recently presented at the conference for the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association, and I also did this presentation for a paramedic group that I volunteer with that we're designing online training. So the beginning, quite a few people had a lot of experience, so I'm sure everybody who's done instructional design or has done training will agree that instructional design really is as much of an art as it is a science. Although there's a lot of theory, adult learning theory and everything that goes behind what we do and supports what we do and provides us evidence that we are training properly, there's still a lot of creativity required. So it's a balancing act, and it's one that I really enjoy. But it is, a lot of people think if they just follow all the adult learning theory that they'll design good training. And I think we've all been to courses that look like that, and they just lack creativity. So really our goal as instructional designers is to be creative and while we meet all the requirements of what it is we need to do. I know I haven't seen it that commonly, but there are some instructional designers that actually call themselves learning architects because the type of work we do is very closely related to what architects do. So I'm going to go over the instructional design process. This is my own process. I sat down and thought about how I design training. It's not like a magical science. If you look at my process, it very much looks like ADDIE. Most processes look like ADDIE because that seems to be the logical process that we follow. I created this one based on the step-by-step how I get through it. And although I'm presenting it as a linear process, it's very common to keep looping back when you're actually designing and making changes as you get feedback from stakeholders and present stuff and go through checkpoints. Quite often you'll get feedback and you'll end up looping back and going through part of the process again. So although it's presented as a linear process, there's really a lot more looping going on than I have here. I just wanted to give a nice clear step-by-step process really for people just starting out. Basically, it's what I wanted when I first started, and I couldn't find it anywhere. I couldn't find a just basic step-by-step process that would tell me this is how to design training. Instead, when I went and after I started training and decided to pursue it in university, I was very excited. My first course, someone was finally going to teach me how to do this. And instead, I spent 3 days learning. You can do all different ways to create training manuals. So it was 3 days if you can do it this way or that way or this way or that way. And I left understanding that there's a lot of different ways to do a training manual, which was great, but I also left more confused than when I came in. So it was a long process for me to really get comfortable designing training. So now I've decided to sort of help other instructional designers and give them what I didn't have when I first started, based on my own experience and obviously finally being able to put all of that education into practice and figure out how all these theories actually apply in the real world. So linear process, but we all know the reality of it is not that linear at all. It would be nice if it went that smoothly. So the first step in the instructional design process is to conduct a needs analysis. This is the one, and I'm just as guilty as everybody else. This is the step that we usually skip or we assume. We all sit down, usually there's 4 or 5 of us sit at a table and say, okay, so what are we gonna do this training for? If we're lucky to have 4 or 5 people on our team. And then we decide what it is we need the training for. So we either assume we know, or we don't go through this process at all. For people who just open a PowerPoint and start designing, they don't do this at all. They just start designing and they decide for themselves. We really, as a profession, need to start doing a better job at this. So I'm going to stress it quite a bit. It is really important, and it's something that we are not doing very well at. really we need to look at what the gap is, where are we now, and where do we want to be. That's our needs analysis. What we don't do is we don't look at it from all angles. Really what we should be doing is involving management, people who will be taking the courses, their supervisors. They are over top of these people, so they'll be able to tell you what's missing, what they think they need to know. You can get more senior people who are on the job, which would be good, because they can look back from a perspective of, oh, I wish I had that training when I was at that stage in my career, or back when I first started this position. So really, I mean, if we think about how often do we actually go out and do this? Not often enough, for sure. So when you're doing needs analysis, you really, really need to look at it from every angle of who's coming, who benefits from this, who already knows a lot about this topic, and try and get as much information as we can. And I'm sure we would be pleasantly surprised that the things that our stakeholders can come up with that we hadn't already thought of. A lot of them will be the same as what we'd come up with, which is why we think we can do this by ourselves. But they'll come up with something that you hadn't thought of, or some sort of angle that you hadn't come up with. So the first stage that we usually skip, that we shouldn't be skipping, is needs analysis. The next step, once we've sat down, looked at everything, so what do we need, is to come up with a course goal. If you ever read a syllabus, or you're deciding whether or not you want to go on a course, and they'll write a couple sentences, this course is going to prepare you to conduct a legally defensible interrogation. And that's the course goal. So it's a very high-end statement, just overall, what do you want to achieve with this training or this course? And this defines the purpose. And although it seems like it should be obvious, this really becomes a guiding principle later on when people keep trying to add topics or throw different things in or bring in different angles. Your goal really is the principle, and it guides your development process. It's really important. So take a minute, especially at the beginning, what is it I want to achieve? And jot that down and keep it documented, because you'll probably go back to it later on. The next step is the biggie, the one where you really painfully sit down and scope out exactly what you want to achieve with the course. Purpose was a very high-level statement. The learning outcomes are exactly what you want people to be able to do at the end of the course. And actually, when I document learning outcomes, I write that sentence at the top: at the end of this course, participants will be able to ... So what are they? And then I do a bulleted list and finish that sentence. It's a tough stage to do when you have nothing in front of you, but it's well worth it. Really, if you take the time and do this step properly, you've laid the yellow brick road for the rest of your design work. As you go through the process, you'll see everything ties back to learning outcomes. They really are the solid foundation of a course. When I first started designing, again, before I had the experience and education behind me, I actually used to write my learning outcomes last. So I'd go and do my PowerPoint and content and topics and put everything in there, and then I'd be like, so where did I end up? And write my learning outcomes. My senior manager at the time almost had a heart attack, because we know that that's not how you're supposed to design, but it seemed easier. To me, it's like writing the introduction of a paper after you've written the paper, which I still do. But then I realized the amount of struggling that went on in between trying to do the content and topics, because I didn't sit down and lay out the learning outcomes first. So this is the sort of the painful, crummy part of design, is creating those learning outcomes and documenting them properly. But it's worth it. It's worth the pain of doing this, and everything will go much smoother afterwards if you take the time and write out a good solid set of learning outcomes. They're not in concrete, so to speak, in that they can never be changed, but they should be fairly solid. Maybe you can add one or two as you go along and you realize maybe you forgot something, but in general, they should stand. And one of the reasons why we do that is because it stops scope creep. and I don't know if anybody else has had this experience, but I have, where subject matter experts keep throwing more and more topics in. Oh, you have to talk about this. Oh, don't forget that. Oh, you got to talk about this as well. And then when your course keeps growing and growing, and what happens when they keep squishing in more content is they start pushing out engagement and exercises because they feel it's more important that they stand up there and lecture to their PowerPoint a little longer. And the good components of your course, the part where everyone actually gets engaged and starts learning something, starts getting pushed out. So these are really vital to good design. Write your learning outcomes and stand behind them, and don't allow the scope creep to happen. In my experience, when they come back and say you have to add this, you have to add that, my response usually is, well, I guess we're adding a day to the course then, because you're not going to start pushing out the components that we need in order for this course to be effective. And it's worked for me in the past. They either will agree to take it out, or they'll agree to add more time to the course so that we can do it justice. But learning outcomes set that base for you. And I also, if you're working with subject matter experts with a team, I have everybody sign off on the learning outcomes at the beginning so that we have agreement. And then it's a lot harder for them to go back and make changes afterwards. So very, very important. Create a good foundation for your courses. So writing learning outcomes. When I'm evaluating, I evaluate a fair bit of training, take a look at stuff. The first thing I look for when I'm reading learning outcomes is, did they use the word know or understand? If they start with the word know or understand, then I know the learning outcomes are not that strong. That's rule number one of writing learning outcomes. They cannot start with the words know or understand. The reason why we do that and why we're so adamant about that rule is that learning outcomes need to be measurable. And you can't measure knowledge or understanding. That's in somebody's head. So when you're writing your learning outcomes, you have to go one step further. How would I, as the instructor, know or be able to assess that they know or understand somebody? So how are they going to show us or show the instructors that they know something or that they understand it? And that's how you write the learning outcomes. What are they going to do to show us that they have this information in their head and they've learned it? So don't use words know or understand. And it's a signal, if anyone's ever assessing your training, that it may not have been written by somebody with a lot of experience. When every learning outcome starts with they're going to understand this and know that and understand this, that they aren't well-written outcomes. So to write good learning outcomes, this is just one example. Basically, this is all based on Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy, which everybody uses. Google it if you're not familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. It really is a guiding principle for writing learning outcomes and for training. So Benjamin Bloom identified 3 ways that people learn. Cognitive, which is information processing, knowledge, psychomotor, which are physical skills, and affective, which are beliefs and values. And within each domain of learning, there are levels that go from basic to mastery. So the pyramid that you're looking at on the screen here, these are the levels of learning within the cognitive domain. So they start easy, remembering and understanding, very basic levels of learning. Then it goes up to application, which means you're applying it in a very similar, the same context in which the information was given, like logging onto your computer. That's exactly the same every single time. So you're applying that information. And then we go up into the higher levels, the analyzing and evaluating, which means now they're taking that information and they're applying it to different contexts to assess, usually surrounded around decision-making once you're up into these levels. So now they're applying information in numerous contexts. Things won't be exactly the same as they were in training. And then the very top level is creating, which we don't get into very much. That's sort of like a PhD level of creating knowledge and research, which we don't really get into that often, but it's considered the highest level of mastery. So when you're writing your learning outcomes, decide what they're going to be able to do with the information. Is it background information? Do we just need them to remember or understand something so that they have the basic knowledge? Do we actually need them to do something so they're going to be applying? Or are we going to need them to use this to make decisions? And then within the pyramid here, there's a list of verbs. And these verbs help you write learning outcomes. If it's just information, then you would start with words like compare, describe, define, list, outline, recall. Sometimes it becomes a game of thesaurus.com, so that you don't use the same word over and over again. But I do try to consider how they actually would demonstrate the knowledge. And I use that. So I use outline quite a bit if it's a process, describe if it's a theory or a policy, they can describe that. So I look at what words apply, and I try not to have all of my learning outcomes start with the same words. So one example for this presentation, when I was designing it, one of my learning outcomes was outline the steps in the instructional design process. Because it's a webinar and it's more one-way communication and we're not doing a class together, it's a lower level. Remembering and understanding is that hopefully you come out of this being able to discuss or list the steps in the instructional design process. If we were actually in an instructional design course and I was teaching it, then the learning outcome would sound more like determine the learning outcomes for a selected course. Because I would want you to take this information that I'm giving you for learning outcomes and be able to apply it to any course that you're designing. So it moves up into the higher levels of knowledge. I do have this pyramid and the process in a handout, so if anybody wants it afterwards, feel free to shoot me an email and I can email it back to you if you want it to print off. All right, so now we've done a needs analysis, figured out as a whole what we want to do with our course goal, and then written the learning outcomes. So the next step is to consider how are we going to assess the learning. So you look at your learning outcomes, and our goal when we're designing training is to try and come as close to the learning outcomes as possible. I understand there's situations where we can't. We would love to be able to create a live scenario. I worked with occupational health and safety for a while, and as much as we would love to do full scenarios, we can't go and put people up on a roof without fall protection just so that we can practice the scenario because we're putting people's lives at risk. So our goal is to try and come as close to our learning outcomes as we possibly can in every situation. Sometimes we have to go, instead of the full-blown people up on the roof scenario, we'd have to go to more of a written scenario, or we have to do scenarios where we just tell people you have to pretend that they're standing on a roof without fall protection without actually putting them up there. But our goal is to get as close to our outcomes as possible. So if our outcomes say that they'll be able to assess the situation and make a decision, what do we think the assessment would look like? Chances are it's going to be some sort of role-playing, case-based, so we would have a written test with scenarios, something around those lines where they have to assess the situation and articulate their decision-making. If it's more knowledge and understanding level, then that's where we get more into basic written tests, either quizzes, multiple choice, something along those lines. So it's all based on what's in the application. Chances are they should be demonstrating something. If we did how to log into a computer, we would probably want them to show us how to log into their computer to show that they gain that knowledge. So that's the big one. That's the summative assessments. And we always consider, so at the end, how are we actually going to test it so that we can prove learning occurred. Usually this is more for our side, everybody who works in organizational learning, because we need records and we have to prove that the training was effective and that we actually taught something. We have some level of formative assessment to show that they attended and they learned something. What I see a lot in design is that people don't think about the other options of assessment. We also have the option of doing pre-assessments or formative assessments. Pre-assessments are done at the beginning, hence the name pre-assessment, and these serve a number of purposes. Have you ever gone to a course and they start out with some sort of quiz right at the beginning or just some questions that you can answer? That's a pre-assessment. Reasons why we use this, first of all, you can evaluate their existing knowledge on the topic. see where they're at. Obviously, we all have different levels of experience and knowledge. A pre-assessment allows you to assess. If you're going to look at the results, you'll be able to see where everybody stands on the topic. Other reasons we do this, it piques people's interest. Sometimes we consider it a catch to get them thinking about the topic, getting them in the right headspace. A pre-assessment can do that. It can get them thinking about what they already know. You can even have them write some sort of example or some experience they had. They can jot that down as part of the pre-assessment. You know, write down a time you attended a course that was really well designed or something like that. And it gets you start piquing their interest and getting them in the right headspace to think about the topic and what their existing knowledge is. There's a lot of theory around that, and constructing knowledge based on what you already know by attaching new information to existing information. And in order for that format to be successful, you have to drop the existing knowledge in the first place. So pre-assessments are a great way to do that. Formative assessments are done throughout the courses. They may or may not be graded. It depends on how you design them. What you're using them for. You can, if you're going to grade them, you need to tell people ahead of time and make sure that the criteria is very, very clear on anything that you're grading. So you can do tests, quizzes, exercises throughout the course to assess where they're at. The real benefit of doing this is it's all in the feedback. They've done studies where they did regular teaching, lecture format, etc., and then they get to the end and they write a test, versus a course that had quizzes with feedback throughout, and they could review their feedback and learn from it. And the results of the studies all showed that people learned a lot more with the embedded quizzes throughout. That format of learning is very, very effective. Trying something out, getting it wrong, learning from that, and then moving forward. It's a great way to learn, and very effective as well for the facilitator to see where everybody's at. So you don't really want to find out at the end of a week that you completely lost them on one section. It's a lot easier if you find that out on day 2, that maybe they didn't particularly get what you were covering on day 1. So you have an opportunity to give the feedback, learn, and sort of catch everybody back up to where you want them to be. So formative assessments, very, very effective and not used as much as they should be. So when you're looking at your assessment plan, you look at how are we going to measure at the end, but also what are our opportunities to assess learning throughout the course instead of just at the end. Then once we've looked at assessing learning, the next step is to look at evaluation. So how are we going to determine that our course was successful or not successful? What's our approach going to be to this? Are we going to do a survey at the end of the course, which everybody is familiar with, either paper-based, online? Are we going to look at how happy they were, what they felt with the course? Or are we going to go further? Can we follow up 3 or 6 months later and see if they were able to apply the information on the job? Was it actually useful? You can go again, sort of like the needs assessment, not only to the people who participated in the course, but you might also want to talk to their coworkers, their supervisors, and see if the application's actually happening. Was there some level of transfer from the classroom onto the job? I know as an instructional designer, it's very, very disheartening when we pour our heart and soul into a course, and then we find out 3 or 6 months later that they're not even applying what we taught them on the job. So then we have to go back and look at the course and the processes surrounding the course to see if we can improve that. If you want to go to the highest level of evaluation, you would want to look at whether or not the course made a difference as a whole to the organization. So on a much larger scale, did you make a difference? The challenge with this, and where I've made a mistake in the past, was not getting a benchmark. So at one point we did a bunch of training on correcting common errors. People were making a bunch of mistakes, so they came and said, can we try and reduce the number of mistakes being made? So we created training, brought everybody in, and then afterwards we went to assess the project, and of course management comes to us and says, so did the training help? And that's when we realized that we didn't collect any stats of how many errors there were before they actually attended training. So we had no way of knowing whether or not we actually improved the number of errors because we didn't go and get the benchmark. And this is one of the main reasons why you want to be looking at evaluation now, so early in the design process, before you've created PowerPoints and all your documentation. You're already thinking about how are we going to assess this, because if you need a benchmark, you have to go out and get it before you actually release the course. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck like we were, and you're not going to be able, you're going to have no way of knowing whether or not your course actually created the improvement that you were trying to create. So benchmarks are, sometimes they're easy, sometimes there's a lot of stats that already exist that allow you to benchmark. We also did customer service training. Lucky for us, there was a lot of stats and calls were graded for the call center, and so we had a lot of statistics to go off of so that we could go back later and say, okay, so after they attended customer service training, did it actually make a difference? Did the number of complaints go down? Did the scores of the calls go up? So we were able to, because of all the existing statistics, without having to go and get a benchmark. But at this stage, when you're solidifying your course and what it's going to look like and all of your training, these are all the things that you should be looking at: assessment, evaluation. So how are we going to measure all of this at the end? Then after all these steps, we finally get to the fun part, the course design. This is the part where most people who don't have any experience designing training, this is usually where they start. They start by opening up PowerPoint and figuring out their topics, and so they end up starting at step 6. So when I'm going to talk about course design, I didn't get too much into, obviously it's only an hour, so I didn't get too much into sort of figuring out your topics and the order and how you do that. Obviously that goes first. What content are you going to cover? And then when you've got your topics, you can start figuring out how are you going to engage your participants in your training. So what type of exercises are we going to do to engage them? And these are the things I was saying earlier, that when they start adding more and more content and more PowerPoint slides, these are the things that they try to squeeze out. So you have to be fairly strong and defend them. So the types of exercises, just in general, that you can look at. So you have individual exercises, so things like answering questions. They can either be written questions in their manual, just throwing out questions to the group. Reflecting on experiences. I talked about that earlier, having people write out an experience and think about it, and working through real world problems. So we can do case-based learning where we give scenarios and give real situations and have them work through them individually. We do a lot of this based on what the results we're looking for at the end of the course. If they're going to be working alone when they're out on the street with whatever exercise, logging onto their computer, etc., then chances are we're going to build in some individual exercises so that they are working alone in the classroom as well with the assistants. So we're trying to sort of recreate how we want them to transfer this learning after they leave the course. But we also have other opportunities to engage and have them engage in collaborative learning by doing larger group exercises. So you can put people in pairs. This is one that I don't think we use as much as we should use, is just pairing people up. This is great when your classes are larger. One of the best reasons for doing this is it engages everybody, because we all know that most classes have a select few people who are very keen and outspoken and like to do a lot of the talking. I may or may not be one of those people in class most of the time, but there's usually a few people who sort of dominate the group discussion. Pairing people up gives everybody a voice and gives them all a chance to talk, and it stops people from disengaging, sitting on their phones and not paying attention because there's only 2 of you. There's no way of opting out of this. You're going to have to participate, or you're going to have to admit that you weren't paying any attention. So this is a great one for involving everybody and making sure everybody has a chance to do what it is we want them to do. One of the common things, and you can also build this on top of an individual exercise, is you can have them write an experience or answer some questions, and then we call it think, pair, share. So then ask the participants to pair up and share their answers with each other, And then as a group, you can come back and ask a couple of the pairs to share their examples. It's good for problem solving and role-playing scenarios. So obviously we used a lot of pair role-playing. Verbal judo would be one where you could really use this, where they can practice their statements and applying stuff. I used it a ton in customer service training. I used to call it finding your voice. So figuring out what words you're going to use, because it's going to be different for everybody. For all of my law enforcement friends, we all know verbal judo, and no two people apply it exactly the same. Everyone has to find their statements and their words and what works for them, what's their style. We're not going to enforce scripts on people. So pairing up and doing these very small role-playing exercises gives people an opportunity to figure out what they're going to say and how they're going to use it. So it's good to do sort of smaller version role-playing. It's a little bit loud, so you may need some space, but it works really well. Then we have group exercises. This is when we need to generate more discussion, when we want people to debate topics, sharing experiences. Again, it's a little bit larger group this time. A little more opportunity to disengage, but still it's pretty hard in a group of 4 for one person not to participate. So it does keep everybody involved and working through things, but this would be at a much sort of higher, more in-depth level. We do investigation training. We do a lot of group exercise through that, because they're working through problems, so they get to discuss how they're going to, what their response is going to be, have to come to agreement. And we all know that's what it's going to be like in real life, that there's usually a couple people involved in decision making, and they're going to have to state their case and come to a decision. So again, it recreates a real life. It also, through the group, allows them to learn from each other, share their experiences. We all know we're going to have people in there that are more experienced than others. So they can also learn from each other. And then we're engaging in collaborative learning, which is very, very effective. Not everything has to come from the instructor. Also, the last point, when you're considering how you're going to design exercises and put them in there, is to consider skill building. So one of the things that I often do, although, like I said, they may be doing something and making decisions individually when they're on the job, they may not, we don't necessarily want to start there. We don't want to throw them to the sharks and have them decision making on their own. So we may start out with a group exercise or a pair exercise where they work together, figure something out, come to a solution. Then the next time we do it, maybe they only get to do it as a pair and discuss. And then the last time they go through, or when we do the assessment, they're actually doing it on their own after they've had the benefit of learning from everybody else. So this is called scaffolding, if you want to Google the theory behind it. But essentially, we're building knowledge, but we're also building to independence. So we don't necessarily have to start with the individual exercise. Sometimes we start with the group and we work towards the individual. These are all things that we're considering when we're looking at how in-depth the topic is, how complex, how high up are we getting in decision making. Again, moving towards independence and having them do things, but also giving them the benefit of the group. So the last type of engagement I'm going to talk about, this is primarily based on feedback I received when I presented this. A lot of people were very interested in gamification and said it was the part of my presentation that they really liked. So I thought I'd just throw in a slide and talk a little bit about gamification. I know we tested out the raise hand feature, or we can use the chat feature, but if you can, raise your hand if you play Angry Birds, Candy Crush, Call of Duty, any sort of first shooter, Xbox type games. I'd raise mine. I don't actually have that option on mine, but so I got 6. So 7. Good. So 8. So we have a pretty good chunk of the group here, me included. I won't admit what level I'm on in Candy Crush, but I play a lot. And so when we look at games, obviously they've figured out the trick. They know how to make a lot of money off the creation of games. Even games that appear free are generating millions of dollars. So there is something to games, even in this day when everyone's talking about how we now have the attention span of a goldfish. We have no attention span whatsoever, yet when we start playing games, children and adults, we're engaged for a very long period of time. and we're heavily engaged. So researchers wanted to know what is it about games that draws us in and holds our attention, especially when we are supposed to only have the attention span of a goldfish. So what they found out when they did this research, some of the characteristics they found that make games so successful are competition. So we see that a lot. I have a teenage son who was just announcing to me the other day that his NHL team is in the top 3,000 in the world. That's competition. Anytime they're rating people against other people in any form, that's where we see leaderboards. I know on Candy Crush, every time I finish a level, it will tell me if I beat one of my friends from Facebook. Anything along those lines, that's competition. And they find some way to put it in because it's proven that if there's competition, people will try harder. Even people who say they're not competitive, once you start playing games and training, you see a very different side of them very quickly. Some of the other things that are involved in games that make them so successful is feedback. And Angry Birds is a great example of that. You go to shoot and you miss. And so what do you do next time? Oh, I got to go a little lower, a little higher, a little more this way because you got feedback. It didn't work. So then you try it again. So that feedback that you get. And the other characteristic, which is very key to gamification, is repeated tries. So allowing you to do something, die, like Call of Duty, when you get shot by somebody hiding behind a corner, then you know for next time to watch over there. So it's the repeated tries. So you do something, you fail, you learn, you try again. Do something, fail, learn, try again. That is basically the gist of gamification and why it's so successful. And so now our goal is to figure out how we can take those characteristics and put them into training so that we can get the same type of engagement and hopefully the same type of dedication that people have to their video games. Very interesting because we've always used games to teach children, and yet people didn't realize that they're just as effective working with adults. I know after my last presentation at Alida, I was talking to somebody who teaches ground fighting for law enforcement and also runs his own school. And he came to me and said, oh, after the course, after I took your class, I decided to change the way I did my presentation at the conference. And I put in a bunch of games and competitions. And it was amazing. Everybody participated and we all had so much fun and it was great. And he said it was really funny because I've always taught children like that and it never dawned on me to teach my adults the same way. So that was excellent for me because I got very quick feedback. The gamification is something that people are very interested in and something that we're probably not using to its full advantage. All of the games that I have up on the slide, I've used in training at least once, probably 20 or 30 times, each one of these games. So I've used Jeopardy quite a bit. The very first time I used it, I was working for a big utility company. We had done a whole bunch of training on a new project. Our entire system was being changed. We trained people. And then when we had 2 classes left, they came and said, oh yeah, the project's delayed by 6 months. So what happened, they went and made a bunch of changes to the project. And then when they came back, they said, okay, so we've made some changes and now you have to retrain everybody. And somebody was designing the training and they'd come up with all these PowerPoint slides and we're reviewing what we went through the first time when we trained everybody 6 months ago. And I thought, well, that doesn't seem like much fun. Why don't we try a game of Jeopardy instead? I was terrified because I thought everyone's just going to sit there and stare at me and think that I'm crazy. It turned out that wasn't the result at all. They all participated. We had a great time and we covered all the topics that we needed to cover. Learning from my mistakes, I did tell them, oh, when you're ringing in, if you are a little bit louder, you might get my attention and I might choose your team. So this is where you really undervalue how competitive people can be. I had people like banging shoes on tables and jumping up and down and jumping off of chairs trying to ring in. It got a little crazy. So this is where you learn and make your requirements tighter every time you do this. I've learned not to do that anymore, but it was very, very successful. And nobody looked at me like I was crazy or was angry that I was making them do something. Really, my tips for gamification, make sure it applies to what you're doing. And has some effectiveness, try and engage a bit of competitiveness, and be very tight with your criteria and really think through how you want to do it. And application is very, very important. Review exercises are probably the best place to put in games. That's where I use the trivia game all the time. I actually have split them into 2 teams, and I have them write questions at the end of the day based on what we covered. And then on the next morning, they come back and they get to challenge the teams with their questions. And we do points, and if it's a long course, we keep track. We do very small. You can do like little chocolate bars. And sorry, I just had a question that distracted me. Sorry, I'll get back to it though. Yes, I am recording this for the person who asked the question. And so what happens, then they come back and challenge each other with their questions. We keep track of points. It's great. As the designer, it's no work for me whatsoever. All I had to do is be very, very clear with the rules for writing the questions. We did like a get to know you fun game. One of the questions was, how many people in the room do you think have tattoos? And then the next day on the review exercise, the question was, how many people have tattoos? No, that's not the point. So your rules get tighter every time you do it. And every time they try and stretch the rules, you get a bit better at it. But it's an excellent trivia game. I've kind of given this one away in all my sessions, but it's very, very effective. And it's a great way to end the day. You wouldn't believe the review that they go through trying to write good questions. They'll kill themselves trying to make great questions, and they review all of the content that you covered. Then the next day, trying to get the answers right, they go through it all again. And they have fun, especially when you do it time after time, because then they're considering their questions during the day, even while you're teaching. They're very, very effective. So I use a lot of trivia games, especially when it's no work for me. Crossword puzzles are just a fun way to review. If you Google like free crossword puzzle creator, there's tons of them online. You don't even have to pay anything. You just input your clues and your answers, and it actually creates the whole crossword puzzle for you and puts it out in a PDF so that you can put it in a manual. Lots of resources. Same with Jeopardy, Family Feud, all these games. There's tons. If you Google PowerPoint template Jeopardy, you'll find something. I'm a Prezi user, and I even have a free template for Prezi that's all set up to do Jeopardy. It has the music and everything. So there's tons of free resources out there to incorporate games. So this is the whole process. Once we've gone through the course design, which is obviously a huge step, this is where we write the lesson plan, create all the course materials. This is where you do the PowerPoints or the whatever visuals you're using, create a facilitator manual, learner manual. So course design obviously is a huge step in the entire process. I'll just show you really quick in relation to documenting your course and creating it. I do it in a lesson plan. So this is what my lesson plan looks like. So I have basically the introduction, so we'll do a welcome. Up here, you can either put down your topic title, or you can actually, I've seen a lot of lesson plans where they actually write the learning outcome right here. So it helps them keep track. Then we just do an overview. In this section, we're going to talk about 3 techniques for interrogation. And then what exercise are we going to do? So how are we going to apply those techniques? So I'll write out what the goal is. I design training that's taught by other people. So I have to be very, very clear in lesson plans and facilitator guides exactly why everything's in there. If I don't explain why, then the facilitators will sometimes throw out exercises and things that are really important because they don't understand why they're doing it. It's also very hard for them to support it when they facilitate it if they don't get why they're there. So I'll do the reason why we're doing this is that they can practice applying the techniques to different situations. So I'll do a little write-up, and then I'll actually give the instructions that I want the facilitator to use. Obviously, if you're teaching for yourself, you can just write very brief notes on what you want to do. I put breaks in here. They're not set in stone. Breaks should be done based on the group and all the signs and when you're actually teaching. It just helps us keep track of time to have them in there, but certainly it's just a basic guide. It's not a do or die that you have to break at 9:15 exactly. And then it also reminds me to make sure we put in icebreakers and review exercises. So that's the basis of what a document looks like. So I'll create this, and then I'll start the PowerPoint after here when I start actually inserting all of the content. Up to now, I haven't done any content whatsoever. All I figured out is topics, learning outcomes, and exercises. Then I start working in all of the content and what we actually want to teach. All right. Obviously, then the last step in all of this is to go and teach it. During facilitation, if it's a strong design, there's a little less of applying a lot of the adult learning theories because they should be built into the design, but there's still a lot around facilitating and reading your audience, knowing who's in your class, being able to work towards what's there. So there is a lot of work to do even when you come up to the facilitation. One of the things that I talk about is just how you're going to set up the classroom. Sometimes we don't get a choice. We've all been in buildings where we have absolutely no choice how it's set up. But other times we do have an opportunity to move the room around. So there's some different options that are a lot more effective than having people sit in traditional tables and chairs all facing forward. And so there's some different options there, which should really be based on how they're going to be working. If you're doing a lot of group work, then you probably want to sit them in groups. If you're doing a lot of discussion, maybe consider a U-shape, horseshoe, something around those lines so that everybody can see each other and actually talk instead of people having to talk to the back of other people's heads, which can be very frustrating. So that's one of the considerations when you finally get to the last step is how are you going to teach this? So that's the basis of my presentation. I hope it was useful. I hope that even just to give a process and a bit of an overview as to how I go about designing training. If you are interested, I do have a full 5-module online program that covers every one of these steps, much more in depth with a lot of exercises and engagement so that you can try it out. It talks a lot about the decision points and what considerations do you have, even in evaluation. Are we going to do online versus paper-based? What are the considerations for that? So the every module is at least an hour long, so it's a fairly in-depth program that really goes through all of my process and all the considerations when designing, provides a lot of examples like the lesson plan, etc., so that you can take them away if you want to use template examples similar to what I use when I'm designing training. And all of the 5 modules follow exactly what I just talked about. There we go. To access the program, if you're interested, it's on my website, odintrainingsolutions.com. I do have a coupon set up for everybody who came for 25% off. It is priced in Canadian dollars, since a lot of you are American, just so you know, that's like a 20% discount off the top, since it's priced in Canadian and we're at 80 cents on the dollar. But there is an additional 25% off if you use the code webinar before Saturday. So if you order either tomorrow or Friday, the code will work for 25% off. And if we have any questions, there isn't a lot of time for questions. Like I said at the beginning, I did set up a separate room. If people are interested, we can go there. If there's anything you want to actually discuss, a meeting room allows for two-way communication. So I set that up in case anybody was interested or had anything else to do. And there we go. Should be it, just making sure all questions are answered. Okay, perfect. All right, thank you very much for coming, letting me try out this format for the first time. It's very interesting. It's a little odd not being able to see anybody, but it's obviously we have to love technology and the ability for me to sit in my home office and do this. So I really hope it was beneficial. If you have any feedback, any questions, feel free to send me an email. My email's up there, carrie.avery@shaw.ca, or you can always reach me through my website. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope it was successful. I have recorded it, and I think everything went all right, so I'll probably release the recording. And if other people want, I can always look at hosting it again, either on this topic or on something, a specific segment of instructional design. So thank you very much for coming.